Alrighty guys, so we're going to go ahead and get started with our third part of our toxicology and drug chapter. So today we're primarily going to be looking at groups of drugs, and so we're going to get into some of the street drug stuff that I know you guys were kind of interested in learning more about. So there are several classes of drugs, and so they are organized into the following categories. So you have your hallucinogens, which are drugs that alter normal perceptions, thoughts, and moods. You have your narcotics, which are substances that relieve pain and cause sleep, but do have addictive tendencies. Stimulants, which increase alertness and activity. Anabolic steroids is a class, which are substances that promote tissue growth, typically muscle tissue growth. And then depressants, which are substances that depress functions of your central nervous system, so mainly your brain, which tends to bring about a sense of like calmness and can sometimes bring like tiredness or sleepiness as well. Alright, so we're going to go ahead. We'll definitely talk about the first two, and then I'll check my time and see where we're at with that. So our first class of drugs is your hallucinogens. Sometimes these are nicknamed your psychedelic drugs. With these drugs, so if someone is on or takes a psychedelic or hallucinogenic drug, what happens is that the part of the brain that is responsible for interpreting the different senses becomes extremely self-aware and almost becomes bombarded with all of the senses around them. Okay, so there's a part of your brain right on the very top, like right where the top of your head is, that collects all the normal senses, okay, like smell, sight, touch, what you hear, all of those senses. But what happens is when someone takes a hallucinogenic drug, that part of the brain, it almost becomes overactive, okay, and instead of like sorting out all of the important sounds and smells and tastes and everything else like that, all of a sudden it's collecting all of the senses at once. So what happens is when all those senses are coming together, this is going to cause what people will sometimes, these hallucinogens, or sometimes people will call them trips. And these trips can kind of be a little terrifying at times. And so when someone is tripping or has those hallucinogenic substances inside of them, they oftentimes will lose control. And oftentimes, because all of the senses that normally are kind of organized and sorted out when they enter the brain, because of the hallucinogenic drugs they are on, there's no sorting, there's no organization. So because of that bombardment of all of the messages from your senses, a lot of times this causes people to go into almost like a panic or a frenzy. There have been situations where, in severe cases, people have actually like taken their fingernails and clawed their eyes out because of the hallucinations that they have seen. Okay, there have been people who run out in front of cars on purpose because they think that someone is out to get them and that they have to, run towards lights, okay, to escape from people. So these effects can be very severe. Now they do vary in intensity and in effect depending on like who you are as an individual and which hallucinogenic substance you take. But just know that they can be very severe and oftentimes can even lead to death if not careful. Okay, so with the different types of hallucinogens, so hallucinogens, kind of the broad terms, there's lots of drugs that fall underneath of this. So the first one is what you've probably heard is ecstasy. Okay, it's technically called, it's abbreviated MDMA. The full chemical name is super long. It's like methylene dioxymethamphetamine, which is why they abbreviate it MDMA. Now, with this chart, you'll see like the name of the drug. You'll also see like characteristics of drug overdose. So a lot of these will be very similar because they are grouped in this class. Okay, and because they're grouped in the hallucinogen class, they have the same effect. So that's why you're going to see a lot of the same repeats through here when you're looking at symptoms of a drug overdose over these particular ones. So ecstasy we will kind of get more into as we continue through this chapter as well. It is a club drug oftentimes. It sometimes goes by like the street name Molly. And what happens with ecstasy, so once again, it lets in all of those senses that normally kind of get sorted and organized, okay, in your brain. And when I'm talking about sorted and organized, I mean like, okay, so you might hear some background noise, but your brain sorts it out and kind of just ignores it. Okay, if your brain loses that sorting capability due to hallucinogenic substances, all of a sudden you're hearing every single sound from every single angle. Okay, it's really almost too much for your brain to handle. So a lot of these will include like increased heart rate and blood pressure. Sometimes this can lead to panic attacks. Yes, I know that's spelled horribly wrong. Sorry, was not paying attention. It can lead to different types of organ failures, so especially like within the kidneys, and some within the digestive system as well. Obviously, hallucinations or trips, sometimes psychosis will play a role in these as well. So we see a lot of the kind of same symptoms. So when you're looking at someone and they're showing these symptoms because of an overdose, it's sometimes really hard to identify what drug they actually took because the symptoms are so overlapping. Okay. Other hallucinogens, so mescaline, which mescaline is actually a substance that comes from a cactus, the peyote cactus. Sometimes the street name is just called peyote. And so people, okay, similar to maybe what you've heard of like people eating mushrooms, instead people would eat parts of this cactus, like the inside part, not the spiky part, and that would give them that same type of high that they were looking for. LSD and PCP are both under hallucinogens as well. So LSD, you see some of the street names here, okay, and then PCP, which is phenylcyclidine, but street names can go by a bunch of different things. Okay, they all have various names, and the names kind of differ based on like where you are in the United States. So a name of a drug that might be used in one part of the United States will be different in there. Might be different on the street versus in prison, which is why they get so many of these street names, which we're going to get into. Okay, now we are just kind of introducing these today. We're going to get more into some of the details of these and the charges that can go with them and the symptoms and things like that later on this chapter. Okay, so here's our hallucinogens. The next kind of broad topic I want to introduce to you is narcotics. Kind of a huge problem here, especially in Ohio. Put all that in there. Okay. So with narcotics are able to, they don't play so much with the sensory part of the brain. They're going to interact with the parts of the brain that sense pain. Okay, and so what happens is with narcotics is they target those areas of the brain, and then they actually almost numb that part of the brain in a way, okay? And so those neurons that typically tell you when something hurts, okay, they will not be able to sense that pain anymore. Okay. And so this is great if you've just had a major surgery and you need painkillers, okay? But we have to be super careful with painkillers because with narcotics and other painkillers that fall under the narcotics category, there can be a tolerance that's produced, more of that on the next slide, and then oftentimes there could be withdrawal symptoms, okay, especially if somebody is on that pain medication for a long time. One thing I'd like you to know is narcotics are mostly derived from the opium poppy. So this flower right here is actually where the majority of your painkillers and your narcotic drugs come from. Okay, now it's not the flower part. So like if you see this flower, you don't just like go bite the flower. It's actually the seeds of the flower. So once that flower is done blooming and everything else like that, people will dry it and then collect the seeds, oil the seeds down, and that's where the opium will come from, which is found in a lot of narcotics. Good. Now, when we say tolerance, so tolerance is very much related to the physical dependence aspect we talked about yesterday. And so tolerance is just basically the more you take a drug, okay, or the longer you take a drug, oftentimes the more of the drug that you will need to take to get the same effect. Okay, so if you're on a painkiller, okay, for a very long time for whatever reason, as that time progresses, you're going to need more and more of the painkiller to numb the pain. So it actually is almost like it builds up, which is why doctors and physicians, if they prescribe narcotics, are very careful with how much they prescribe, and how long somebody is on them. Okay. Now, what happens is, after a while, if someone's been on it for a long time, there will often be like a withdrawal period. Now, if you are prescribed a narcotic because you've had major surgery or whatever, the doctors will oftentimes only prescribe a very small dose so that you do not go through withdrawal symptoms. Okay, so what withdrawal symptoms are, basically, it'll be the opposite of the main effect of that drug. And that goes for pretty much all drug categories when we're talking about drug withdrawals. So if we're talking about narcotics, which dull the sense of pain, okay, reduce the sense of pain, all of a sudden the withdrawal effect of that would actually be your brain almost becomes hyperactive in those pain areas if you've been on painkillers for a long time, and it almost feels like your whole body is on pain, okay, from what I've heard at least. Okay, oftentimes there can be, like, other than major pain, there can be fevers and even some like organ failure associated with it for people who are addicted to narcotics. So with one of the more famous narcotics, and one of the ones that is very big in our state, so heroin is one of the most addictive types of narcotics, just because heroin takes a very short amount of time to actually enter into the brain. Okay. And so with most narcotics, you're looking at, like, most people say they would feel the effects of those narcotics within like 10 minutes. Heroin was within a matter of like a minute or two. It is also very highly addictive, so oftentimes we see that people who are addicted to heroin get addicted very quickly. Okay. One of the reasons why heroin is so scary, other than it is very highly addictive, is this drug is not always as pure as what it should be. So whenever heroin is made, okay, whenever heroin is cooked, technically is the term for it, the purity of it is oftentimes kind of questionable, and that means that if you have a very pure amount of heroin, it takes less to get high. If you have a very small or a very tainted amount of heroin, okay, so like if the heroin is not as pure as it should be, okay, it's going to take more to get the same high. And what happens is people, because they have a varying dose of, or varying purity of heroin, what happens is people over time can oftentimes overdose easily because they're used to less pure substances, and then all of a sudden might get a pure substance. So Ohio is one of the top 6 states for deaths from heroin overdoses. It's something that's super common. Like, I will tell you, like, the majority of my high school class that I graduated with, maybe not the majority, but there are multiple people I know who are dead from heroin overdoses. You know, and I grew up in, like, Lexington. Like, it's not far away. You know, they're either dead or they were in jail. We had heroin overdoses before I graduated even. Okay, there are people in Shelby. There are people in Mansfield. So there are people all around who are addicted to this. And it's not a drug that, you know, most people think like, oh, someone who does drugs, they're scraggly looking, they're bad people, they don't have jobs, yada da yada da. And that's not so much the case. Oftentimes, people who are addicted to heroin might have great family lives, might have good jobs, might be people who just, you know, wanted to try it once, but then become addicted to it because it is that addictive. You know, I've seen people, you know, people who I grew up with who, you know, had a good job, went to college, got a degree, had a family, have kids, and then they get addicted to heroin and drop everything and throw everything out the window for that drug. Okay, and, you know, and this is before they even turn 30. Okay, so it's one that's definitely scary and one that is definitely a big issue here. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and stop here with this. I know I'm not quite done with this section, but I'm getting to my time mark here. So these are all the different forms of heroin. So there's black tar heroin, which is the stuff that kind of gets cooked down. Heroin powder, which is oftentimes like snorted or sometimes smoked. Packaged heroin, which is a finer or more pure substance than the heroin powder. Okay, there's less additives to it. And then there's injectable heroin, which is probably the most common because it is the easiest way to get that high. Okay, you can see street names up here, right? But at this time, I'm going to go ahead and stop here for today. We'll go ahead and continue. We'll finish up narcotics on our next one and then get into some of the stimulants and depressants. Okay. As you guys have questions, as weird as they might be, let me know. And then I will talk to you guys later. Hope you're doing well.